In the summer of 1861, two construction gangs set out from opposite ends of a continent with nothing more precise than a rough sketch and a compass heading. One crew left Omaha moving west, another left Sacramento moving east. Between them lay 3,000 miles of tall grass prairie, high desert, salt flat, and mountain range that no telegraph wire had ever crossed. The challenge was not just the distance, it was that no reliable survey existed for most of the route. No federal agency had mapped the terrain at the detail a telegraph line requires, pole by pole, across the full breadth of the American interior. The men building this line had to find the way as they moved, set poles in ground they had never stood on a week before, and string iron wire across country with no infrastructure, no supply depots, no roads a loaded wagon could reliably travel, and in many stretches, no timber at all. The technology that would have replaced this work with something faster or safer did not yet exist. What existed was a convoy of men and oxen, a spool of No. 9 galvanized iron wire, a supply of glass insulators, and a deadline set by Congress. The deadline was July of 1862. They finished in October of 1861, 9 months ahead of schedule. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Pacific Telegraph Act, signed by Abraham Lincoln in June of 1861, authorized Hiram Sibley's Western Union Telegraph Company to connect the Missouri River to the Pacific coast by wire. Congress offered a 10-year government communication contract worth $40,000 a year to whoever finished the job first. Sibley had reasons beyond the money to move fast. The Civil War had begun 3 months earlier. California was not secured to the Union in any reliable military sense, and the fastest way to close that gap was a telegraph line. He split the construction into 2 companies working toward each other. The Overland Telegraph Company would build west from Omaha to Salt Lake City. The Pacific Telegraph Company would build east from Sacramento to meet them. The man Sibley chose to lead the eastern push was Edward Creighton, 41 years old in 1861 and a working telegraph man since 1848. Creighton had spent the previous winter walking much of the intended route, on foot and by horse, traveling from Omaha to Salt Lake City through deep cold to see where the line could go and what it would cost to build. That winter walk gave the eastern crew the closest thing they had to a usable ground survey. On the western section, James Gamble managed construction for the California partners. His crews faced a different version of the same problem. Once they crossed into Nevada, the Sierra Nevada was behind them, but ahead lay the Great Basin, largely unmapped at any scale useful to a construction crew. Terrain shifted from hard-pan alkali flat to fractured volcanic rock to open sand without pattern a supply wagon could anticipate. Water in the Nevada interior was separated by distances that, in summer heat above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, could kill a draft animal before the next source came within reach. Gamble's crews moved their water supply on dedicated wagons and carried forage for their animals because the desert floor offered nothing worth eating. Both crews needed poles before any wire could go up. This was the first and most stubborn physical problem. A telegraph line requires a pole approximately every 150 to 200 feet. Across 3,000 miles, that spacing demands somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 poles. The tallgrass prairie of Nebraska had no trees. The Nevada desert had almost none outside river corridors. Creighton's solution in Nebraska was to send procurement teams ahead of the main advance, ranging out to river bottoms where cottonwood grew. Cottonwood is not ideal material. It splits along the grain, rots at the ground line within a few seasons in wet soil, and is difficult to pin at the top without cracking the wood. But cottonwood was accessible within hauling distance, which mattered more than any quality consideration. Teams cut poles in the river bottoms, trimmed them to length on the bank, and hauled them to the line by ox wagon. The longest haul runs on the Nebraska section, stretched 40 to 50 miles over unbroken sod. A loaded pole wagon carrying 6 to 8 cottonwood poles 25 to 30 feet long weighed close to 3,000 pounds. An ox team pulling that over open prairie made 12 to 15 miles a day under good conditions. In Nevada, the western crews used whatever the ground would give them. Along the Humboldt River Valley, they cut willow and wild cherry from the streamside growth. Out on the open playa where no wood grew within a practical distance, they bundled sagebrush and drove the bundles into the ground as temporary poles, getting wire up on them until proper poles could be hauled to the section. Stretches of the Nevada line in the construction year looked like they had been built by men making decisions 100 yards at a time, because that is exactly what had happened. The sagebrush bundles did not last. They shifted in hard wind, settled unevenly in the alkaline soil, and let the wire down at the binding points when the bundle compressed under its own weight over time. They were never intended to last. They were intended to get the line up and keep it conducting until a proper pole could reach the section, and they did that. And when the railroad arrived years later, the permanent replacement work moved fast on a route that was already running. Setting a pole was 2 men's work in loose soil and 4 men's work in hard ground. The tools were an iron-shod crowbar for breaking the surface crust, a long-handled narrow spade for pulling material from the hole, and a tamping bar for packing the fill after the pole went in. The hole had to reach 4 to 5 feet in most conditions, narrow enough at the bottom to grip the pole base against the lateral tension the strung wire would put on the structure. In clay, 2 men could open a usable hole in 20 to 30 minutes. In hardpan caliche, the same hole took an hour of bar work and digging, and more bar work, breaking the ground ahead of the spade in chips too small to feel like progress on any single stroke. The pole went in, was held plumb by wooden prop sticks while the fill was tamped back in layers, and was packed solid before the props came out. The crew moved to the next location, paced out from the previous pole, and started again. A well-drilled crew in cooperating soil could set 12 to 15 poles in a working day. At that rate, a single mile of pole line consumed close to 2 full days before a foot of wire went up. The wire ran on glass insulators, squat threaded cups in olive green or pale aqua, depending on the manufacturer, roughly 3 inches across at the top groove. A tapered wooden pin, driven into a bored hole at the crown of each pole, received the insulator's threaded base. The wire ran through the groove and was tied off with a short binding of the same wire, looped and twisted tight in a coil of several turns. The glass kept the wire off the wood and the wood off the earth. A telegraph signal is a small electrical pulse that dissipates to ground through any point of contact with wet wood or damp soil. A single compromised insulator in a wet season could kill transmission across hundreds of miles. The insulators were packed in wooden crates with straw on the supply wagons. A day of active construction consumed 200 to 300 of them. They cracked in hard frost and shattered when a pole fell, and breakage on wagons running over rough terrain was a constant draw on stock. Crates had to be replenished from the nearest depot, often a Pony Express relay station 50 or more miles back. The supply system had no fixed base for most of the construction. The line of forward progress was the camp. Scouts moved ahead of the construction crew, locating water, assessing soil and timber availability for the next working section, and marking the route with stakes where the terrain offered no obvious corridor. Behind the scouts came procurement teams ranging out for poles. Behind the procurement teams came the construction crew digging and setting and stringing. Behind the construction crew came the supply wagons shuttling back toward the nearest resupply point for insulators, wire reels, hand tools, food, and animal feed. The whole operation moved as one connected system across ground that was not a road before they arrived on it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The wire itself was number 9 gauge galvanized iron, roughly 1/10 of an inch in diameter, shipped from northeastern rolling mills by rail to the Missouri River and by sea around Cape Horn to Sacramento. Each reel held about a mile of wire and weighed close to 300 pounds. The reels were loaded on wagons, the wire end paid out and carried up to the insulators as the wagon moved forward along the completed pole line. One man managed reel tension to keep the wire from overrunning and kinking on the ground. Others walked beside the wagon, lifting wire into each insulator groove and tying it off. At the end of a reel, the wire was joined to the next by hand, using a twisted splice. Each cut end wound tightly around the other's shank in 5 or more turns. A good splice held as well as the wire itself. A bad splice worked loose under temperature cycling and eventually opened, dropping the line. A dropped line on open prairie could go unfound for days, and any gap in the circuit killed transmission from that point forward until a maintenance rider located the break. The rate of advance varied sharply by terrain. On the Nebraska sections following the Platte River Valley, where cottonwood was accessible and the ground was manageable, Creighton's crew posted 8 to 10 miles of completed line per working day on a productive push. In the Wyoming high desert, where the ground was frozen caliche in the mornings and every pole had to be hauled from 30 or more miles out, the rate dropped to 2 or 3 miles. The crews worked from first light to last. The schedule had no margin built into it. Days lost to equipment breakdowns or weather or hardware shortage came off a total that could not absorb them. The risk to the men came from the work itself. A green cottonwood pole, 25 feet long and 8 inches at the butt, weighs 300 to 400 pounds. Getting it upright into a 5-foot hole without mechanical assistance required either a gin pole arrangement with block and tackle and a horse on the haul rope, or the simultaneous effort of 4 or 5 men pushing and lifting from different angles while one guided the butt end into the hole. If the rigging failed or a grip gave out before the pole was seated, the weight came down on whoever was in its path. No complete injury record for either construction crew has been located. The Overland Telegraph Company's construction documentation has not survived in any archive I have been able to identify. What does survive in the field correspondence from Creighton's advance confirms that men were lost to draft animal accidents, to equipment failures in extreme conditions, and to the physical demands of sustained heavy labor in heat and cold with no shelter and no reliable means of evacuation. Summer temperatures in Nevada reached above 115 degrees Fahrenheit on the salt flats west of the Humboldt Sink. Water rationing on the western sections meant men working long days in that heat on short allowances. The condition the era called sun sickness, what later medicine would describe as heat exhaustion, was a documented problem on the western construction. On the Wyoming section, the cold arrived early in the fall of 1861. Crews stringing wire in October worked below freezing with high desert wind at their backs. Frostbite in the hands reduced the dexterity needed to tie wire at insulators and to handle the small hardware the connections required. Men worked through it because stopping was not a practical option with the schedule where it was. The Nebraska Prairie introduced a problem no one had anticipated. The telegraph poles were the only vertical structures across large sections of the route, and bison used them the way they used the occasional lone tree, as scratch posts. Animals weighing close to a ton rubbing against a cottonwood pole driven 4 feet into soft sod toppled the pole. Maintenance crews in the first year of operation replaced dozens of poles in the Nebraska section that had been knocked over this way. The partial fix that reduced the rate was driving angled, sharpened stakes around each pole base to make it uncomfortable to approach, or wrapping the lower section of the pole with material that disrupted the motion. Neither fully solved the problem. The bison had been using that ground long before the poles arrived. The maintenance obligation they created did not end with the construction season. It ran for years, and the men who rode that Nebraska stretch checking for toppled poles were doing it in all weather, including the winters that pushed temperatures well below zero on the open plain, with no windbreak and no shelter within reach between stations. On October 24, 1861, the wire from Creighton's eastern section was joined to the wire from Gamble's western section at Salt Lake City. The Overland Telegraph Company had strung 695 miles from Omaha. The Pacific Telegraph Company had built approximately 1,000 miles east from Sacramento. The Utah section between them, roughly 500 miles, had been built by workers contracted through Brigham Young, who supplied local labor and knowledge of the terrain his people had settled since 1847. Young sent the first Transcontinental Telegraph message from Salt Lake City to Washington that day. It arrived in seconds. The Pony Express, which had been carrying mail and dispatches across the same territory for the previous 18 months, shut down 2 days later. 180 riders, 400 horses, and 150 relay stations across nearly 2,000 miles became unnecessary in 48 hours. What replaced the original line over the years that followed was the railroad. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific completed their transcontinental rail connection in 1869, running telegraph wire along their rights-of-way as an operational requirement. The rail corridor gave maintenance crews the supply access to rebuild and maintain the telegraph infrastructure far more efficiently than the original construction had managed on open ground. The cottonwood poles rotted and were replaced with cedar, brought in by rail. The sagebrush bundles in Nevada came down quickly once rail access reached those sections. The insulators cracked in frost and were replaced by improved designs. The line that had crossed the continent in 112 days in 1861 was continuously rebuilt until it bore little physical resemblance to what the original gangs had strung. The glass insulators from the original line still surface along the old route. Farm fields in the Platte River Valley, dry washes in Nevada, cultivated ground in Utah where the old alignment crossed irrigated land, turn up olive-green cups with threaded sockets intact, coming out with the plow or washing out of eroding banks. They sell in antique shops along the corridor for a few dollars each to buyers who may or may not know what they are. The glass is over 160 years old. It held the wire that carried the first electrical signal across this continent. The men who threaded that wire through those grooves in 1861 do not appear in any record that has survived in useful form. The construction logs, to whatever extent they were kept, have not been found. Creighton's field correspondence from the Advance survives in fragments. The workers who dug the pole holes and strung the wire across 3,000 miles of open country are present now as a number in an authorization, 112 days, completed on time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.